There is, but it's not being used in this at all. So it's something that gets formulated later on, but also in Cicero on the laws and on the Republic. It's the notion of natural law. And not the notion of natural law as we get it in later early modern and Enlightenment thought, but the notion of natural laws, we find it in like medieval philosophy and theology, which has these different components to it. So one is that um, as the kind of beings that we are, and we share some of this in common with other beings, we have whatever you want to call them, like drives, inclinations. There's different words that get used for this, to doing certain kinds of things, to valuing certain kinds of things, right? Like the affection of parents for children and children for parents. Now, of course, that can get screwed up, right? I mean, there are some parents who don't care at all about their kids or exploit them. There are some kids who, just turn out bad even though they got good parents. But there's a sort of normativity to it. So we've got this sort of drive. And then, with Seneca, you've got that analogy thing. We see models and we kind of think that they're like, these people have it figured out, right? And then we can apply our faculty of reason and whatever you want to call it. We can purify, we can more, adequately understand these inclinations and maybe shave off some of the rough edges or things that are just culturally conditioned, and we can derive some general ideas about how we ought to live. And these are what, like, Thomas Aquinas will call the precepts of the natural law, right? Now, Aquinas thinks that they come ultimately from God and the eternal law, but we don't actually need that stuff in there to talk about this idea. And in Western thought, the idea of natural law, the beginnings of it, you can find some stuff in Aristotle, in the rhetoric and the politics, but not much. And it's not enough to really build anything on. It's the Stoics who are generally credited with formulating a more robust conception of natural law in this way. And now you notice that none of this is actually used that very term, but they're all kind of circling around it. So there is a word for it, and it's basically that tradition. I won't say, I do want to say the Stoic natural law tradition is not the same thing as like that which Thomas Aquinas is putting forward, which is much more both Christian and Aristotelian. There's going to be differences, right? But the general conception is basically the same. Yeah, it would be. I mean, this is one of those places where, I mean, it could be that the Stoics are wrong and we should always look out for our self-interest. This is often just called egoism, as a moral theory. And there's a lot of different iterations of it. It could be that both are wrong, but it's clear that one of them cannot be the case. If either one of them are right, the other one has to be wrong.
They're mutually exclusive.
Yeah, exactly. And for that reason, because, well, we're going to see more discussion of that in Cicero and Seneca. This, I'm going to look out for myself first. That is what leads to injustice. I mean, it's not to say that you shouldn't look out for yourself at all, but there's bounds to it, Whereas if somebody's committed to some version of egoism, not only do they think that they ought to prioritize in every case their own desires, preferences, outcomes over those of others and cooperate with them only insofar as it's going to lead to good outcomes for themselves. Weirdly enough, they also tend, if they're an ethical egoist, they will say everybody else should do that, but everybody else are a bunch of dummies, and that's why things aren't working out the way that they should. And it is a prevalent concept, right? And it's embodied in a lot of, as oftentimes moral theories are, it's embodied in a lot of like proverbs. You got to look out for number one, man. It's a dog eat dog world, right?
Yeah.
If you hear that stuff all the time, you will kind of you're going to assume that's the case. And a Stoic would say, well, that's because you've assented to whatever you want to call them, appearances, dogmata that you probably shouldn't have assented to. And you keep on assenting to them. You keep on thinking they're the case. Now, sub virtue. So they didn't have um, conception of leadership as such. It's interesting because there's contemporary books out there about like, the Stoic leader and I haven't actually looked at any of them, but I intend to see whether they're actually like just making stuff up and throwing in a little veneer of Stoicism or whether they actually are drawing on stuff. You could, and leadership itself is a poorly defined term. A lot of people love it because it sounds really cool, but leadership studies is kind of a hot mess. There's all sorts of different theories of leadership out there, but we could get into that and like distinguish different theories of leadership, and then say how Stoicism would conduce to that or not. I mean, there's a lot of it is going to be like managing things justly, right? The leader is going to need wisdom, justice, temperance, courage. I suppose that you could say when you've got discussions like what we brought up before, Musonia saying kings need justice for this reason, kings need virtue in general. That would be an example of that. Or you could look at Epictetus and his counsel to people who actually have power, right? How they should be using it. But it wouldn't be a sub virtue. It would just be like distributed over the virtues, you could say, right? Well, so there's nothing that says that these natural instincts and drives are going to automatically find their target, right? And so one of the features in natural law theory is being able to say, well, why, if we have these natural instincts to the good, why are people so screwed up, right? And so, the Stoics have certain answers to that, lack of education, bad education, being drawn by our childhood love of pleasures and avoidance of pain, bad examples, stuff like that. Thomas Aquinas will talk about, bad customs and use examples taken from Aristotle about societies where certain practices are just really screwing people up. And Aristotle, interestingly, in talking about brutality in book 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics, says that um, certain things, morbid dispositions, but also certain social practices can render a person really, really screwed up in a way that's like beyond vice. And he uses as an example the abuse of children, sexual abuse of children. It's often not, the translators don't like to talk about that. So in a lot of the older translations, you won't see it referenced as such, but that's what the Greek term there means. And I would say all sorts of, traumas like that can really do damage. And sometimes egoism is more just a matter of like protecting yourself from a perceived hostile world. Protocol. Yeah, I think he'd be an example, right? But you'd probably want as many examples as you could, and then put together a composite picture. But yeah, Marcus is in the leadership of leadership positions. Right? That proverb, the buck stops here. The buck literally stopped there with him. They said a lot about it, and part of that is what we're going to get to when we look at piety. Just to give you a little hint, the Stoics think that we belong to our families, determinate communities, and stuff like that. But we all do belong to not just the human race, but a cosmic city or society of gods and human beings. So we're not even the best thing in the cosmopolis, and yeah, they're not the first people to come up with cosmopolitanism. We see Diogenes, the cynic, saying stuff like that. We see Socrates saying stuff like that, although he didn't really travel much, as it's pointed out to him, right? Only when he has to. But there was this notion that the whole world is my city. And so it's not just that I'm home anywhere in the world. Everybody is potentially my fellow citizen. And so, yeah, the Stoics definitely are proponents of that. And that sets up certain tensions, right? Because, well, what if something is good for the world, but not so good for my family or not so good for my country? Um, if you really were a cosmopolitan, there's probably a lot of sacrifices in today's world that would be expected of you, right? I wouldn't, and here's why. I think there is a genuine issue, and not just with the Stoics, but with a lot of ancient literature of how to adequately render things from one language into another without losing too much in the process or seemingly adding too much, right? Because the problem with justice is a lot of people do associate it with like, I just have to follow the rules and then I'm just, or something like that, or I have to divide things up nicely and then I'm just. Um, this is a general problem, and I think there's basically two, what should we call them? Uh, Two modes of solution that people take. One is to try to find a better term, one that is closer in, we'll call it semantic range to what's being rendered from the original. And then the other is to include like provisos and say, okay, we're going to use this term, but don't understand it to mean just this. And that's usually what I do. And I've done a lot of translation work. Mostly the published stuff is Latin and French, but I translate from Greek and German as well. And I think early on, I used to try to steer more towards the first thing. Like, I got to find the best term for this. And it turns out in a lot of cases, there just isn't a good term. Now, with Arius Didymus, some of the translations, could they be better? Like piety is fine, right? Um, good fellowship. It's got kind of a weird, old-fashioned sound to it. I might pick a different term. If I wanted to be very literal, instead of saying kindness, I'd probably say like usefulness, but it is knowledge which is disposed to do good to people. So kindness kind of does work. And so I don't usually think I do the second thing. I say like, okay, we need to understand what they really mean by this. And I do that in my classes with my like students who are right off the bus freshman year walking in when we're doing Plato or Aristotle or whoever. But yeah, I mean, the trouble is, unless you have those sort of clarifications, you pick up a text and it's been translated and it's got these terms in it, and you're like, I know exactly what that means, right? But it can be misleading. And I don't
Oh,
think there
so
is I don't think there is a good solution, really. Yeah, I mean that's about application. And sure, that would add more complexity. Uh, Disagreement. So we're using rational in two different ways there. So if you're fully rational, which very few people are, then yeah, you're going to arrive at completely correct judgments. Who does that? The sage. Where's the sage? We don't know, right? So rational people who have the capacity for rationality aren't perfectly rational. And sure, they can arrive at opposite judgments. Sometimes their opposite judgments are one is mistaken and one's not. Sometimes it's more a matter of nuance, and that's where like these other virtues could come in. But you're not going to have consensus, but that's not the measure of whether one is doing the right thing. It'd be sort of like asking a bunch of people who don't know much about music, is Iron Maiden the best metal band or not? Well, who knows? You you got to actually start clarifying things in order to get there. So there's two different important issues there. One is, yeah, if you it's not enough just to have justice. You do need courage and you do need temperance. You do need wisdom. All of these need to be working together. Um, And then there's the whether everybody is going to agree or not, and the fact that they aren't, does that mean that somehow rationality isn't enough? Um, I mean, we never have completely rational people. Even Seneca, he's got letters where he's like, "I'm giving you this advice, Lucilius. By the way, I don't completely follow this. Here's where I fail in this respect." I mean, I can tell you that myself in the past, when I would hear God talk about stuff like that, I would just kind of like pass over it. Like when I was in my teens and early 20s, and I would just be like, people believe all sorts of crazy stuff. I don't need to worry about that. Just let me get the other stuff. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff I mean, just as much of the Aristotelian physics and cosmology, right? I mean, nobody's like, um, well, Aristotle had it all figured out, and we need to stick with him. That died back in, the early modern period. It's funny too because like there have been all sorts of more scientific paradigms that have been left behind. Rene Descartes had all sorts of interesting physical ideas, and there were Cartesians out there, and it was kind of an established thing. And then, people were like, actually, this doesn't work. This is wrong, and you leave it behind, right? And think about like the crazy German idealist stuff. Um, Hegel and Schelling have these very complicated systems of nature that basically are just no good at all. They're only good in an allegorical sense, but people bought into them. So we don't necessarily have to commit to every bit of a philosophy in order to find it useful. And you know, what would a Stoic say? I mean, if we do have better science, wisdom would seem to say go with the better science, right? you know don't just say, well, we like this idea better, it looks a lot more attractive, but it's not true, but we'll believe it anyway. That would be kind of foolishness, wouldn't it? When you say it like that. We do have like a choice. So there's this, I brought this up last time. Marcus articulates this a bit more than Seneca does, but the random Epicurean atoms, or providence that actually cares about us in some way, we don't know which it is. Not knowing which it is, does that prevent me from living a good life? And the answer is no, I can. Now, if it's helpful to have hopes, I guess that something could be the case. Is that a bad thing? I mean, the Stoics, strictly speaking, don't like hope, but maybe what they are condemning as hope isn't the same thing that we always mean by it. Mark says piety would be the motivation of self-transcendence. Yeah, I mean, if there is something within us that is potentially better than the human beings that we currently are, and we cultivate that, and that's what Seneca's talking about, these seeds within us, and that's piety, that sounds pretty good. Um, and it's not necessarily tied in with a God who's outside of the universe or something like that. I mean, I don't find myself at all attracted to Stoic pantheism, and this idea that there is a logos pervading the entire universe, like the traditional Stoics believe. Um, because it doesn't seem to be. I mean, if this is a really well arranged universe, I must be completely mistaken about what well arranged looks like, because all sorts of things go wrong, right? And you can do you can do the equivalent of God works in mysterious ways, I suppose, from a Stoic perspective. But I just don't find that very attractive myself. But maybe some people do. Maybe that gives them hope that they need to get through the day.